Kestrels lay at 2-day intervals and can have between 3 and 7 eggs. These eggs aren't incubated right away. Brooding typically starts when half the clutch is laid. Over the next 4 days, she lays the second, and third egg. As April arrives, unseasonal storms sweep the Yorkshire countryside. The pair are vigilant, perfectly timing their changeovers to ensure their eggs don't get cold. And as the snow melts, Mrs. Kes continues to lay. She soon reveals egg 4. 5. And then 6. Until finally their clutch is complete. This experienced pair have been together 3 years now. It's a joy to see them with another clutch of eggs. In just a month's time, their chicks will hatch. And I can't wait to watch this pair step up to the challenge once again. This is the pair's 3rd season together, and Mrs. Kes knows just how she likes to keep her nest. She carefully brings soft wood chippings into the centre to provide a cushioned base for her eggs. She's particularly protective. In previous years, she's fought off numerous attacks. And this he sleeps, she hears a noise outside. Barn Finn lands at the entrance, but soon takes flight. The barn owls haven't laid eggs yet and are checking out potential sites. Finn's mate Gylfie follows. Mrs. Kes leaps up, defending her precious clutch. And holds her position even after the threat has passed. The eggs are unharmed, but she seems rattled by the attack. And the danger doesn't end here. The following day, Mrs. Kes hears disturbance outside. This time it's a pair of jackdaws prospecting nests. They're a real threat. They blocked neighbouring tawny owl Luna inside. Mrs. Kes heads in, but the corvids are curious, landing at her nest too. As one tries to enter, she quickly sees it off. They're visiting the nest multiple times a day. and Mrs. Kes seems visibly stressed. Until finally Mr. Kes swoops in, putting an end to the trouble. It's now the end of April, just a few days before the chicks should hatch. Both kestrels make their final preparations. But when Mrs. Kes heads out to stretch her wings, a red kite. She's soon back at the nest. She just can't seem to catch a break. And as night falls, she senses another threat. Tawny owl Luna lands at the nest. Luna's got chicks nearby and she's highly territorial. Mrs. Kes doesn't want to fight, as tawny owls are formidable opponents. But as Luna tries to enter, Mrs. Kes lunges. She'll do anything to protect her eggs. At the start of May, their troubles seem to be over. The kestrels have been taking it in turns to incubate for 30 days. But now I've noticed Mr. Kes has bowed out of this role. Once the eggs hatch, he'll be in charge of bringing in food, while his mate cares for their young. His lack of brooding is a sign that the chicks are on the way. Mrs. Kes broods the eggs closely. And soon we get a glimpse of the first chick. Kestrel eggs are laid at 2 to 3 day intervals, but as they're not brooded straight away, the chicks hatch much closer together. The second chick hatches only an hour and a half after the first. Soon, Mrs. Kes leaves the nest. And Mr. Kes sees his chicks for the first time. His mate soon returns, and he sets off to find food. Mr. Kes picks up a mouse from the feeding post, where I leave supplement food. He delivers the food to his mate. And she carefully feeds the chicks. It's amazing to see how well they work together. In the afternoon, Mrs. Kes reveals a third chick, still damp. And when she leaves the nest in the evening, her fourth chick has hatched too. As night falls, there are only 2 eggs still to hatch. It's been a busy day. The next morning, Mrs. Kes wakes up early to feed the chicks. And soon reveals the 5th. Finally, the following evening, the sixth and final chick hatches too. This Kestrel family is now complete, and I can't wait to see how they get on. This is Mrs. Kes, a female kestrel brooding 6 chicks. They're just a couple of days old and have got a lot of growing to do. But for Mrs. Kes, incubation wasn't easy. She battled barn owls, jackdaws, tawny owls, and even a red kite. And thanks to her determination, she's now got a healthy brood. She tears prey into small pieces and carefully feeds each chick in turn. While a female kestrel feeds the chicks, the male's main role is to provide for the family. Her mate, Mr. Kes, arrives and drops off his catch. The pair make a great team. But over the next few days, Mrs. Kes doesn't seem herself. She's an experienced mother, but now she's restless. And she's leaving the nest more often than she should, leaving her tiny chicks unprotected and at risk of getting cold. She seems on edge, and even at night she's not sleeping well. The next day, she leaves the nest again. It's just not normal behaviour for her. She's back and she's calling as if she's sensed a threat. It could be the barn owls nesting nearby, or tawny owls, Bomber and Luna, roosting in the trees with the fledglings. But whatever it is, something isn't quite right. As night falls, the atmosphere changes. Mrs. Kes hears the tawny owls calling outside. The tawnies have 2 chicks that have only just fledged, so they're really protective. Luna, the female, leaves and lands at the kestrel nest. Mrs. Kes tenses up, and as the tawny owl tries to enter, she lunges. The threat is over, for now. A couple of nights later, Mrs. Kes wakes. Kestrel struggle to see in the dark, but she senses something outside. She heads out, leaving her chicks alone in the nest. When she returns, she seems rattled and falls from the entrance. She eventually lands, but the ordeal isn't over yet. Tawny Owl Luna takes off towards the kestrel's nest. And Mrs. Kes nearly falls out as she scrambles to defend herself. The tawny owl lands on the camera, but soon takes off. She can't see the threat in the darkness, but she knows it's there. The kestrel returns to the chicks. 10 minutes later, just after midnight, she heads out again. And disappears into the night, leaving the chicks completely alone. By morning, Mrs. Kes hasn't returned, and the chicks are calling desperately. Just after 5 AM, Mr. Kes arrives. After a night alone, the chicks are cold and hungry, but the male has brought food and drops a vole down for them. Although he's equipped to provide for the chicks, he's got no idea how to feed them. They haven't been fed in over 12 hours, and if they don't eat soon, they'll die. Mr. Kes keeps returning with more prey, and the chicks are getting more and more desperate. One of the chicks tries to eat, but they can't feed themselves. I decide it's time to intervene. Chicks are getting cold. Meanwhile, back at the nest, the 3 oldest chicks are huddling up for warmth. It's only been 10 minutes since I returned them to the nest, and Mr. Kes wastes no time in coming back to them. He's brought even more food. But when they won't take it, his instincts kick in. He tries to brood them, usually the role of the female. It's remarkable to watch, but you can tell he's not used to this. And with no sign of Mrs. Kes returning, I'll be keeping a close eye to see how he gets on as a lone parent. Female kestrels are the primary caregivers for the chicks, keeping them warm and tit-bit feeding them. And with her gone, the male just doesn't know how to fill this role. He's unsettled and heads out, as if looking for his lost mate. He returns to the nest with a vole, and the young kestrels call frantically. He shunts a rodent close to the chicks, but he makes no effort to tear it up for them. They're starving. They're still far too small to feed themselves, but they're trying. And Mr. Kes still isn't getting the message. Meanwhile, up in my studio, it's time to feed the smallest chicks again. I've only had them in with me for a few hours, but they're all really hoping I can get these chicks back into the wild. I've just got to hope Mr. Kes learns how to feed those chicks. Back at the nest, Mr. Kes returns with another vole. And when they don't take it, he starts tearing it up and offering them smaller morsels. This is an encouraging start. He's realised they're hungry. But he's impatient. He hasn't quite mastered it yet. In the afternoon, I head down to feed. He's soon back to the chicks. He broods them, but he's restless. He just can't seem to get comfortable. At the entrance, he calls for his mate. It's tough to watch. As he flies off, the chicks are alone once again. But at dusk, Mrs. Kes miraculously returns. The chicks perk up as they hear her outside. She's been gone over 20 hours, but she doesn't enter the nest. And when a tawny owl calls, she bolts off. It's such unusual behaviour. In previous years, she's taken on any threats to protect her own. Without their mother to brood them overnight, they're vulnerable to predators and could die if they get cold. As darkness falls, there's no sign of the male either. So I collect the chicks from the nest. They'll be safer with me overnight.